On this first Sunday of 2026, guest worship leader Sam Farrugia invites us to consider the strange promise of the New Testament, that as we go about this humble, selfless work of modeling our lives after the life of Jesus, we may well find ourselves experiencing true, unquenchable joy.
I don't know about you, but I really enjoy reading other people's mail. Just to be clear, I mean to say that I enjoy reading letters that some people, or more often their literary executors, have chosen to publish for public consumption. Whether it be the correspondence of Audie Nouwen, J.R.R. Tolkien, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I always find it enriching to read these personal dispatches, which were most probably not composed with their eventual publication in mind. All this to say that a good part of the New Testament is made up of just this type of communication. Paul's letter to Philippi is a brief personal piece of writing composed in a buoyant and affectionate spirit and addressed to people whom Paul knew well and whom he obviously loved. This letter, dictated in a Roman jail, perhaps located in Ephesus, shares several characteristics with a more recent letter dispatched from a Birmingham jail in April of 1963, after Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested during a direct action campaign. Indeed, in his letter, and in response to criticism from Alabama clergy that he was an outsider intruding on their turf, MLK Jr. draws a comparison between his campaign of nonviolent activism with the activity of the author to the Philippians. And I quote, "Just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown." End quote. Like Paul, MLK Jr. worked tirelessly for a cause to which he had dedicated his life, the cause of civil rights for African Americans. Paul, for his part, and following his Damascus Road experience, had dedicated himself to what he calls the work of the gospel, the strange but good news of how the God of Israel had proven himself faithful to his promises, that is to say, had shown himself to be just or righteous. Through the death and resurrection of his Son, Yahweh had demonstrated his faithful justice to both his people and the nations of the world. Now, indeed, for the past 5 centuries, debates have raged in certain quarters of the church as to the precise meaning of both Paul's gospel and the righteousness or justice of God, as well as how these two concepts are related. However, when we travel back behind the Protestant Reformation to Paul's world, the world of the first century, we discover that these notions of gospel and justice had quite different and shocking connotations. Indeed, just what Paul meant by the gospel goes a long way to explaining why the return address on his letter to Philippi was that of an imperial prison. Yes, the work of the gospel amounted to nothing less than, to quote contemporary historian Tom Holland, placing a depth charge which exploded underneath the fabric of Roman society, and the imperial ideology that legitimated the systemic injustice of the empire. Paul's understanding of the gospel also serves to explain why Paul's life, like that of MLK, would end violently. And yet there remains something mysterious about the letter to the Philippians. The author, though he is chained and facing possible death, is bubbling over with joy. So no, Paul's gospel was not, in fact, a formula for getting to heaven. Rather, the gospel that Paul proclaimed was news about something that had happened to Jesus. He had been crucified, resurrected, and enthroned as Lord of the world. Now, in the world of the first century, this message was patently absurd. In the Roman Empire, the term gospel was a common term, And it meant one of two things. Either a battle had been won by the legions, or a new emperor had been crowned as Lord of the Roman world. Often it meant both things, with the former resulting in the latter. The irreducible content of Paul's message about Jesus demanded that his audience undergo what New Testament specialist Richard Hayes called a conversion of the imagination. As Paul himself admitted to the Christians in Corinth, the message of a crucified Lord is an oxymoron, foolishness to Greeks and a scandal to Jews. Paul proudly proclaimed that, against all expectations and conventions, a crucified Jew had been raised from death and had ascended to the right hand of the one true God, and now reigned as Lord of the cosmos. As a result, every knee must bow and every tongue confess this new state of affairs. In God's strange providence, Paul's gospel did indeed accomplish its mission of converting imaginations and lives. Paul's Christ communities, like the one in Philippi, were composed of women and men who believed that this news was indeed good, and they strove to live in the light of the disorienting new world which had been created by the resurrection and its aftermath. If Jesus was Lord, that meant that Caesar's claim to that title was now meaningless. Indeed, Paul's gospel was not only logically absurd, it was also politically subversive. Jesus' crucifixion had not been a lynching, after all. Rather, it had been sanctioned by the imperial justice system. As the vanquished members of Spartacus's slave revolt discovered, crucifixion was the Roman way of keeping slaves in their place. The message was clear. Victims of crucifixion had simply gotten what they deserved for having had the hubris to rebel against the divinely sanctioned order that gave Roman masters the power of life and death over those whose lives were their property, to be exploited at will. For Paul to grant the title of Lord to a crucified criminal was, to put it mildly, an outrage. It was to discredit the very system of justice that sustained the empire. Yes, Paul's gospel was absurd, subversive, and liberating. If Jesus, who had been crucified by the empire, had been raised from death and now offered the life of the age to come to those who followed him, then one could inhabit an alternative kingdom. One could live a life whose terms would be dictated not by the imperial machine, but rather by the reign of the crucified and risen one. This was a way for imperial victims to achieve victory, a means for them, to borrow the language of the book of Revelation, to overcome. So that was Paul's gospel. What about his notion of justice? The justice introduced by the gospel is the result of opening oneself to the embrace of the Creator's faithful love, and then looking at all those around you and realizing that they too have received the same embrace. Paul's communities were surprising places where ethnic identities, class distinctions, even traditional gender roles were radically relativized. Even slaves were welcome to worship beside their believing masters in the early churches. And Paul, in his letter to Philemon, begins to subtly undermine the very idea of a Christian master owning a Christian slave. The evil fortress of slavery was not by any means destroyed by Paul, but in the New Testament we can see cracks beginning to appear in the foundation. Historian Tom Holland has reminded us how the Romans viewed and treated their slaves. When read alongside his accounts, the New Testament shows itself to be light years ahead of its time with its vision of the dignity of all people, be they slave or free. I would go so far as to claim that the work of our first century apostle made the struggle of our 20th century activist plausible. Paul's letter to the Philippians helped pave the way for MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail. To quote MLK, "Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace, and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number, but big in commitment. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. End quote. How should we then live? How do we function as a community in such a way that true justice can flourish? As Paul told the Philippians in chapter 1 of his letter, "This is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight, to help you determine what really matters, so that in the day of Christ you may be pure and blameless, having produced the harvest of justice that comes through Jesus Christ." As we all know, much of the world's injustice flows from the prideful domination of the weak by the strong, whether that be in the context of global politics or of our own household. And as we read earlier in Philippians 2, we find this wonderful poem about the pre-existent Jesus choosing to become incarnate and thereby undergo a double descent. First, to adopt the status of a slave, and second, to die the death of a slave. Only afterwards can Jesus then reascend and reclaim his divine prerogatives and receive the name that is above every other name. This is an amazing turning inside out of all conventional ideas about God or the gods. This Christological vision is a complete deconstruction of the notion of power in the ancient world, indeed, in the world at any given moment. And what is even more bracing is that Paul exhorts us to adopt the mindset that inspired Jesus to empty himself. Having instructed the Philippians to imitate the Christ's radical self-emptying, Paul then makes an even bolder move. He invites them to imitate him. Paul made it his life's goal to become like Jesus. In chapter 3 of Philippians, Paul warns the people in Philippi against Judaizers who wanted to maintain certain aspects of Judaism in the new communities that Paul had founded. And as he warns the Philippians against this tendency, Paul describes the confidence in the flesh, as he puts it, that he had previously as a Pharisee. Paul had been a rising star, as a cleric, we might say, before his Damascus Road experience. But now Paul tells the Philippians that he has gone through an emptying process that is similar to that of Jesus. Indeed, he has lost all things because of Christ. Moreover, Paul considers all the things that had previously given him confidence and status to be excrement and a liability. Paul turned his back on each and every prerogative that his religious pedigree had given him. He had done this because he had discovered in Jesus the path to true glory. The way up is the way down. Just as Christ descended to the lowest depth of shame and pain, only to be exalted to the highest place, so Paul is striving towards the mark for the prize of God's call upward. For Paul, Jesus is the standard of human completeness, the one member of the human race who has been exalted to share in the very glory of God. Yes, Paul had gone from being a rising academic and clerical star to being the slave of a crucified heretic. That's a long way to fall. However, from Paul's right side up vantage point, it's a cause for boasting. Paul is a free slave. He has been liberated from his slavery to self in order to serve Jesus and everyone else for his sake. Such is his desire to imitate his divine master that Paul even renounces his own rights as an apostle. That is to say, he supports himself financially while serving the very Christ communities he had founded, and makes himself all things to all people. To quote MLK once again, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of people willing to be co-workers with God. End quote. So, how to be a community of gospel justice in this new year? How to experience life together in a manner that both MLK and Paul would approve of? Let the same mind be in us that was in Jesus. Let us serve our God who became a slave and each other with humility and gratitude. And this is the New Testament's strange promise. As we go about this humble, selfless work, we will experience true, unquenchable joy. May it be so.
Thank you for listening to the Cedar Park United podcast. If it inspired you, or comforted you, or even ruffled your feathers in a good way, please consider leaving a positive rating or subscribing to help others find their way here too. It matters.